right, hello everyone. We're waiting for a while until everyone joins, and then we can get right started. Okay. Nothing like a bit of awkward silence at the beginning. It's always fun. Cool. All right, so I'm just going to get started, make it simple. We're going to talk today about something that all of us will experience one way or the other, which is the need to do something new in these weird times that we're in. My name is Philipp Kristian. You may have read my bio, or maybe you have not, which is fine. Trust me, you'll get to know me quite well during this little session, at least what I care about. And we'll have a lot of fun during that as well. This will be about 20 minutes of, just quick fire thoughts on my world and what I think and do with it. And then afterwards, we'll have a bit of time for Q&A, and that's pretty much it. So, I always want to start with something relatable. So if you don't like cats, sorry, but that's what it is right now. Here's some thoughts on what I think matters in going through the crisis with the trust economy. The trust economy is a real thing. It's also the name of my book, but it's frankly what connects us through things like A Small World or all the other utilities that you use digitally, which connect you to others so that you can trade, you can do business, you can build social connections, and so forth. And in times like these, where the world has actually become very small, meaning it's become as small as your apartment or your house, pretty much, this is more important than ever before, that we connect with people in other means. And the trust economy makes that easy, and it makes that scalable. It allows us to connect with a lot of people everywhere on Earth in the easiest way possible. But before I talk about that, I want to talk, this is obviously not a picture of me, although you may find it personally relatable. This is obviously Superman, or it's, I think, trying to be. Probably the photographer has decided to draw some extras here on this Lego. The point here is quite simple. We have all times in the course of our lives where we wish for superpowers. And perhaps right now during the pandemic, a lot of us were more aware of this, I guess. Perhaps we believe that, we would want an invisibility cloak or other means to get outside during lockdown, or ultimately, find ways of solving challenges that maybe we feel are too challenging or too difficult for us to address. Here's the funny thing, that I've actually talked to a lot of people who have come up with really interesting personal and professional growth during this period. Some of them have also been laid off, so I think it really depends on which side of the coin you're at. But there's a lot of opportunity that always comes when the world hits a crisis. And I think that with your understanding on trust coming out of this and the trust economy, you can really think of that as a cognitive superpower, as a way of looking at the world, which will help you here and also then in the near future that we are about to create. So I'm interested in The Day After Tomorrow, not the movie. The movie wasn't that good. And there's a famous quote, of course, by Mark Twain, never put off till tomorrow what may be done the day after tomorrow. But the point here is that very few people actually think about the day after tomorrow, illustrated by this wonderful picture. It's where really the future gets shaped. The occupation of what's next is perhaps a temptation that we want to yield every once in a while, but really what we want to think about is what's going to happen after that. And frankly, before this pandemic, people hadn't thought about the day after tomorrow. COVID was really, in some ways, a day after tomorrow that nobody saw coming. We knew statistically it was going to be there, but we didn't anticipate it anyway. So I'm in the business as somebody who deals with the future in a professional capacity too. Having mostly worked in innovation and trends and insights, about understanding what that day after tomorrow could be. And while it's usually a shot in the dark, what really does matter is that we actually get closer to what could potentially await us behind the corner, because simply that's the only way to know. Maybe some of you have actually come across Goethe and The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's a really nice fable. It's kind of a poem fable And it teaches us a lot about economics. Why? Well, the Sorcerer's Apprentice is the story of a sorcerer's apprentice, quite logically, who is supposed to carry water into a bath. And because he gets bored and lazy, he actually tries to bewitch the broom that he has at his disposal to carry the water for him. And this works so well that the broom keeps carrying the water, and unfortunately the Sorcerer's Apprentice forgets the master's password of how to stop this broom from doing so. And the moral of the story is that the whole place floods, and basically one of the lines goes, "The spirits that I called, sir, deliver me," where the sorcerer's apprentice is ultimately awaiting the return of his master so that the master can actually stop the spectacle from happening. The reality of our hyper-globalized economic world tells a similar parabolic story. It's where we have been able to create really sophisticated financial markets and ways of collaborating as a species, as a human species. However, we've created a lot of inequality and issues along the way. And as we've seen now with COVID, the global movement that we have done quite indiscriminately in the last years has actually sort of happened at the expense of, certain factors which would allow us to compensate in the time where something like a pandemic hits. So really, we weren't prepared for it because the focus of economics is on one type of capital, which is financial capital. So the classic economics that we are contextualized in misses the bigger picture, which is why a lot of CEOs in North America and other parts of the world have now called for the focus on stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder returns, which means instead of chasing the quarter, you look beyond, and that's where you see actually the world outside. So this is really important because the problem that we are facing right now and the consequences that we are having to deal with the pandemic is a function of short-sightedness, and is probably evident in the way quite chaotically countries around the world have tried to react to this, and how there's always a new news every week on this subject. So yeah, we're going towards a new globalism. And yeah, we're called humankind for a reason, guys. It's not a sort of joke, it's just an observation here. That, a world which is dominated by people who think that their interests are misaligned is a world of war and damage, and it's a world of inequality. So there's a Mandela quote that says, alleviating poverty, for instance, is not a matter of charity, it's a matter of justice. And as we adjust to this new world, we realize very quickly that a better way of working together, a better way of collaborating will free up a lot of new resources, and it will actually create a lot more value, which then when we distribute it means that everybody gets more. So this is the beauty of collaboration, is that 1 and 1 does indeed equal 3. And as we move towards a different type of economic work and a different type of economic interaction, we will be increasingly able to realize that. And yes, as you may have guessed by now, the core to that is trust. Part of the reason why economies do well is because of a high level of trust prevalent in them. And this also goes for the opposite example. The economies that are struggling most are the ones that are riveted with distrust. So we know that on a broad economic level, the trust between people creates frictionless commerce. And on an individual, logical, human level, we know that when we can trust someone, that leads to a better relationship, quite obviously. So what we're seeing right now is almost like a meteorite. This is actually a dandelion. It's nothing bad. But a meteorite in the form of a pandemic, which highlights our shortcomings and inspires us to do better. So, as Goethe also said, apart from writing The Sorcerer's Apprentice, the impossible is often what's never been attempted. And actually, this is what I see with a lot of the executives I work right now with, that they're telling me it's now a time where they can actually drive transformation that beforehand wasn't possible. Example, I have an insurance company client who said that their entire agency force has now been fully virtualized. And that means every insurance agent now conducts their sales business entirely virtually. They've also said that if they had suggested doing this outside of COVID, people would have thought they were crazy and probably quit. So you realize that times really have changed, and they've changed in favor of often radical transformation approaches. So if you're one of those leaders, entrepreneurs, or executives who's ready to make those changes, now is your time to do that. And what I think we're also going to be able to be ready for is that instead of replacing face-to-face, we're going to augment the physical and the digital world. This doesn't mean wearing virtual reality glasses all day, unless you think that's cool, then you can obviously do that. But it means really understanding how we hybridize those two worlds. And, you know, hybridization is also not rocket science. It's just natural that we in the future will have far more choice between when to be physically in an office and when to be working remotely. And I think the level of coordination that requires is going to have to root on trust. If you don't trust your people, it's going to be very hard for them and for you to make them work remotely. At the same time, it's also a pain in the bottom when they're actually in the same place. So ultimately, in order for this hybridization to work effectively, the way we understand trust between people needs to also extend to the digital realms. And it means that we need to be able to build trust with coworkers, even if we may never sort of, or very rarely see them face to face. So this entire aspect of us using technology to build relationships is actually not new, but we have to apply that skill to new areas, and increasingly also to the area of our own traditional work. What we see right now is that tech companies tend to do very well in the current times. We also see that other companies are struggling quite massively. The reason for this is really very simple, that even though tech companies may abuse your trust and may steal your data, what they do very well is trust their own workforce. So working from home and working remotely, working on one's own terms is actually pretty prevalent in most tech companies already. It's part of the culture pretty much. And it's part of the rather agility-driven setup that they have. Contrast this with a lot of big companies like the Big Four and professional services, and you realize that those folks are, in some cases, monitoring their staff for the time they spend online. And they're really struggling with this new liberalization and the fact that people are working from home, bringing, you know, ultimately their house to work as well, because that's, you can't really quite help it doing that. And it's very difficult for them because it's forced them into a digital transformation that they thought they weren't ready for. But the nice thing is that that means they're now catching up. So that really benefits anybody who's looking for a career more broadly, because workplaces will become nicer. Then there's this aspect of customers. So I had a pretty bad squabble with Air France, which you know, has for some reason or another refused to refund a ticket, which they are legally required to refund in the EU. Contrast this with Singapore Airlines. When my Singapore Airlines flight got cancelled, Singapore Airlines actually sent me a message saying, we can offer you a voucher or a refund. So consider that an airline that is not legally required to refund proactively does this, knowing that customers that are refunded and happy will come back to that airline because they're loyal to the customer experience that they receive. And contrast us with an airline which has received $10 billion, actually I think it's $10 billion from the French state, and still keeps holding the hand up to want more. You see the difference between experience and greed. And if you want to take that journey, you'll realize that one of those companies will be very successful going forward, and the other unfortunately won't. But when I say unfortunately, that's actually a good thing, because now, even though some very good businesses are struggling, the worst of the worst businesses are actually the ones that will really have long-term effects from this crisis. Because you and I, our memory, we're like elephants. We remember who treated us well in the crisis and who didn't. So the companies that try to treat us badly during these difficult times are the ones that we're going to avoid going forward. And that means some of them, hopefully most of them, will cease to be. And of course, we can only hope that the people working there can find a better, more productive environment to do their work in. There's also a story of countries where collaboration has, in the crisis, worked far better than competition. Now, you may be from these countries, so maybe you have a different view, but what I've seen and heard from Taiwan versus Italy as a case is that in Taiwan, for example, people voluntarily wear masks. People have cooperated willingly with the government on a proactive level to combat the crisis. Taiwan has not had a lockdown. They've actually braved the pandemic superbly well. And then take Italy. Somebody once told me that in Italy, the government expects most of the people to not do what they say. to violate the rules. So Italy had a very strict lockdown situation, and yet people had initially decided to violate that. At the same time, people felt that this was more about their own freedom going against the government decree. There was not much collaboration. It was more about competing for interests. In a system like that, it's evident that a crisis, especially if in a form of a pandemic, can actually explode and cause major harm. Now, we never really know how it would have panned out otherwise if things had been different, because this pandemic is a first for most of us. But this is just one example for how initiative and proactive public initiative beats policing every time. So the question now is, how do we champion our own courageous leadership in these uncertain times? I actually believe that it starts with recognizing that being a deer in headlights is usually going to be quite a slaughter. And that sort of when you do nothing, somebody else will innovate for you, will change your market for you, and it leaves you in the worst position, which is that of having to react. So I think that requires a certain courage to fail, even proactively, because right now, let's be honest, we're failing either way, and there's risk whether or not we do something. In fact, there's probably more risk when we don't do anything. So again, these times are probably a good reflection for us to be able to realize that we can actually do a lot more than we thought we could. And the other thing is also looking at trust and the world overall as, you know, ripe for a fairer and more symmetrical value creation. When you look at companies that are purpose-driven, I use the example of Hyatt here. What they've done during the crisis is actually, instead of, you know, hosting people in hotel rooms, they sent emails to their guests saying, you know, our purpose is to care for people so they can be their best. So here's a free subscription to a meditation app. I thought that was a brilliant move versus the move that most online travel agents did, which is, you know, don't call us unless your flight or your booking is 5 days away from the actual commencing date. So one is talking about a transactional inability to cope with demand, and doesn't really waste any time on understanding what pains people might be going through. And the other, you know, irrespective of revenue, just tries to help. Again, we know which companies will in the long run fare better. It's usually the ones that have more purpose in what they do. Because especially right now, if you don't have business, then purpose can help you figure out other and better things to do with your time until the times get better. So that really helps us lead with inner conviction and joy, and to sort of also take on big problems which we know are there, and maybe use the opportunity and the time that we have freed up in the current times to address them and to solve them. So it really is about rediscovering what authentically drives us and what leads us to where we're going. And then there's this aspect of the white space. The white space opportunity is something people know under the name of blue ocean. Everybody understands roughly what this is. What I mean by it is that we can use our latent skills and resources, stuff that's lying around, skills we already have, abilities we can already use, and apply that in a new context. This is what startups do all the time. But as an organization, especially if your core business is affected by this period, that's something you can do any day. It just takes initiative. And again, if you take the initiative, you'll be rewarded for it. So, you know, with the famous Oscar Wilde quote to close, we're all in the gutter, but we're looking at the stars, or some of us are for that matter. I have a cheesy acronym for you, which you may remember and then sort of work with. What we need right now is we need a holistic view, in fact, of the business context, our context, and what influences this. So we need to basically kind of look beyond what we're currently looking at and move from a very specific view to a greater focus on the bigger picture. We need to be more open and transparent, especially with each other. And I think we've seen in this global times that there's no way we're going to solve a challenge as big as a pandemic by competing with each other, that there needs to be global coordination and collaboration like never before. Which is kind of also then where purpose comes in. If we know why we're doing something, we're going to focus beyond just the rules, beyond what we have to do. And we'll focus on what we want to do, which is solve this problem, achieve a better status quo. And the last one is really to empathize. It's as simple as that, really to understand where people are coming from, to focus not on their wants, the surface, but to focus on their needs, which is what's underneath. To really understand that at a very human level, our needs globally, irrespective of culture and background, are roughly the same. We all are humans. We all have similar needs. When we think about that, we can actually shift a lot of competitive and aggressive situations to more cooperative and collaborative ones. So this is really all from my side. A few thought starters as you, kind of reflect on what you've heard and make this sort of part of your everyday. You're most welcome to refer to this keynote and, with your clients or stakeholders to find value in it and to see ways in which it can enrich your own horizon. At the same time, I would very warmly invite you to, reflect on ways in which you can make the most of the situation right now, even more so than you're already doing, and find new ways and new connections in that. So that's really all from my side. And I know there will probably be a few questions, and you can be absolutely welcomed to ask them. And of course, you can also drop me a line if you want to have something particular to say. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to just go right to questions where there are any. Thanks for that. Right now I see no questions. So if there's no questions, then I guess it has been well, but if there are questions, please do mention. All right. Right, there we go. Johanna, thank you for that question. So Johanna kind of has written, I don't know if you guys can see this. Johanna talks about how maybe humanity hasn't learned from its mistakes. I think that's interesting. This is probably why there is an enduring need for supernatural ways of understanding the world. So I think people need hope because, the world is screwed potentially. But to answer your question, Joanna, when it comes to a vaccine, people are competing. The prevalent way of solving a problem is usually competitive. So people will think that, when you compete, you're going to get there faster. The reality is, which we've seen also time and time again in the medical and biomedical sciences, is when you compete in a complex knowledge work experimentation, which is ultimately the finding of a vaccine, the actual people that ultimately are detrimented or detrimentally affected by that is the people who these vaccines are tested on, because people make shortcuts because they're so desperate to win. So the reality is, if we had all the world's best scientists collaborate with each other on a vaccine, with commercial interests being equally shared and distributed, which is in fact possible, if people were willing to do it, we would find that vaccine a lot faster. I am convinced of that. So I believe that the reason humanity sometimes takes longer to learn from its mistakes has primarily to do with the fact that those mistakes sometimes don't hurt enough. And when we faceplant particularly harshly, that is when we start learning. So I think that the pandemic is a particularly harsh faceplant for a lot of us. And this then makes me very optimistic that after this, we will indeed learn quicker and more effectively. So I think, also to continue answering, because Joanna has been sharing a lot, I'd like to also say that there is a lot of good reason to believe that actually it's very easy for people to find common ground. I'd say perhaps this is the least common denominator, but ultimately on a fundamental needs-based level, we all have similar needs, and this is where we find common ground and purpose. If we focus on wants, everybody on a surface level wants different things, but fundamentally we all need the same or similar things. So the way to really look at finding common ground and understanding how people can be, acting in a selfless manner, even though their selfish interests are served, is by focusing on needs. As a friend of mine who runs a charity organization in Asia says, if we actually allow people to be individually selfish by, feeling that their own needs are answered to, they can become collectively selfless. And I firmly believe that the focus must be, however, on needs rather than on wants. And that's a way which we could also easily diffuse a lot of political conversations, because politicians talk only about wants. They never talk about needs, as far as I'm concerned. We have a question here from Michael as well. would you comment on the unprecedented emphasis on security, hacking, ransomware, and other real things we're facing? Yes, absolutely. The trust economy doesn't serve as a solve all. The trust economy is a way of collaborating with other people, which is largely safe and which actually allows for us to build trust rather than having to be skeptical or distrust. In fact, I actually think those things go together. The problem and the threat on security, especially cybersecurity, is that we're trying to solve cybersecurity issues with human thinking. And to be brutally honest, humans are not very good at distrusting, because when we follow a process where we all jump through hoops and create lots of bureaucracy and friction and approvals, we're just going to make our life miserable. What we want to do is use technology to detect bad actors. A technology approach to weeding out the bad stuff is far more effective, because technology can much more quickly and at scale actually discover the bad action. And in fact, there is enough use and deployment of pattern analysis and even artificial intelligence mechanisms to be able to detect breaches. So the way I would put it, Michael, is I would say you let technology do the distrusting so that us as humans, we can focus on the trusting bit. And I do believe that that can be very effective. It's in fact, on a strategic level, the stuff I'm working on with my clients, how to operationalize that. So that to me is really not just thinking, it's actually about operating that way. Then we have a sort of anonymous question here. Do you think most of the changes that will follow from the situation will be permanent, or will we go back to, that's a very good question, will we go back to our old habits? I do believe that this is a function of repetition and salience, meaning how much do we believe that this new normal is actually a viable alternative to what we've done before? So when it comes to, for example, events, there is an expectation that there will be some kind of rebound effect, you know, similar to when people get out of a bad relationship, there might be a rebound effect. People are going to do, you know, ultimately what they feel they've been lacking. So we're going to probably see some level of live gatherings, congregations. In fact, in Europe, we're now seeing demonstrations and lots of people partying excessively. I actually think that in countries where there is a high amount of policing during this pandemic, people will actually go absolutely nuts once the veil is lifted, once the restrictions are lifted. However, in countries where people and governments have mainly relied on self-policing and on self-moderation, countries like in Scandinavia, there's likely to be a more moderate response, hopefully. But it's also slightly prophetic to say that, because we don't know. We don't even know what the future looks like in a week's time. So I'd safely say that this has to do a lot with, you know, how we individually conduct ourselves, and the decisions we make will then ultimately lead to a certain future. So if I were to take my best shot at answering that question, I think in certain aspects where it has served us to try out these new, potentially undesired or unwanted forms of transformational behavior, where we have actually changed our behavior in response to the crisis, some of these things will stick. However, other things which, you know, really sort of maybe feel like they have actually starved us of certain humanity, things like maybe, you know, being able to meet strangers and have conversations without a mask, I'm sure those things will rebound just as we would expect. So it really depends on what you're looking at and which aspects of daily life we're looking at, I think. So yeah, I think Joanna's asked a follow-up question. Is it a leadership failure? Well, in the end, it's all about leadership, right? It's not about the people, it's about the leaders or the lack of leadership. I do think on a political level, on a government level, on a governance level, yeah, it's very much a leadership failure. But that's because leaders nowadays are actually almost disabled by the corporate structures and the bureaucracy that we have in place, which is also why people, when they talk about new work, are talking about a much more agility driven, a much less formal and a much more equal and dynamic work environment in which leaders can also effectively thrive. So Olu, right? Is it Olu's asking, is it possible the pandemic is God's way of getting us all to slow down and reevaluate what we are doing to our world? There's another quote there from Albert Einstein, which is, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And maybe fate is too. I think, you know, depending on your faith and depending on what you believe in, it may very well be possible that the pandemic has a greater significance for you, and that it may seem like it actually is driving you to do things which you have always been supposed to be doing, or it's even driving humanity of doing things which have always been due and which may be humanity overall, or we have deferred. So I like that thinking because it ultimately puts what we currently are facing into a productive context where we can make sense of it and process it in such a way that you know, it may actually serve us rather than disable us. So I like that thinking, and I think all of us will have our own ways of verbalizing, and of course also of making sense of the current times. And I actually tend to be more on the optimistic side wherever possible. Michael is also sharing here that I found that COVID has brought me to more of a spiritual state with greater emphasis upon meditation and outreach to spiritual groups. I do see this as a trend, whether that includes reading and transcendence, so whether it's more esoteric or more traditional, I think that's up to everyone. I do think that this is an invitation for spiritual renewal, and it is an invitation for us to find a way of maybe connecting with what's beyond. The reason I think also quite pragmatically, Michael and everyone, is that if you sit up locked in your own apartment, you realize that the things you have and your day-to-day routine is probably not in itself worth living for, right? It's just stuff, really. And maybe some of us have awoken to the fact that we lead pretty ordinary lives on a day-to-day basis, and that maybe we only share, you know, enthusiasm and zest for life when we can actually go out, socialize with others, travel, and so on. So personally, having been on the road pretty much all the time before this, I've seen in myself a similar inclination to kind of clean up the basement, to figure out, you know, what are some of the things within me that I want to develop, and how do I connect to the world and the significance that's ultimately still there. You know, it's not that the divine has gone away, it's just that in bad times it's harder to believe than in good times. And so I believe this is a personal test that's put to all of us. Can we actually brave this? And I've heard from a lot of people that they have actually discovered new angles to themselves and to their way of understanding the world, and also the greater significance of it all. So I think it's probably a good thing to keep pursuing that path, and you're certainly not alone. Yeah, nice questions there. There's a few more. Oh, CJ has asked a question as well. Any recommendation where to get funding for innovative ideas? You see, this is interesting. This is an interesting one because, okay, so you're in Germany. Yeah, I do think Germany has always had a problem with its VC scene. Personally, that's my opinion. Interestingly enough, when I look at Asia, and I'm based in Singapore for the most part. So what we see there actually is that quite a few interesting companies that actually rely on the digital channel and the digital interaction mode have been funded in record time during the pandemic. This is because money that would otherwise be stupid money chasing after bad ideas is now freed up to be available to the best ideas and the best propositions. And there are a lot of tech propositions right now that are hugely benefiting from the fact that companies are digitally open for business, but physically closed, or have been for some time. I also think that during a pandemic, there are new needs emerging, and those new needs may be very easy to talk to because people are experiencing the issues of the current times pretty much every day. So I think innovative ideas is a bit of a broad statement because it could be anything and everything, but the more these ideas can be related either in the story that you tell or in the way that they're addressing a problem to the current times, the more money will be available. And then when it comes to the VC scene here, I honestly don't know how it's been affected by COVID, but knowing Germany as a risk-averse country, it's probably dried up in some places. So I do understand that. Yeah. Interesting questions, and thanks for everyone's contribution and, you know, the thoughts that you've shared as well. It's actually very odd to be speaking to an audience without hearing or seeing or sensing the audience. This is one of my biggest adjustments from being on stages all the time to doing this virtually. So it's actually a really strange scenario to be communicating one way, especially because the world right now is so much of a dialogue, right? Everything is about a conversation. Brands have conversations with people, people have conversations talking back at brands. And the same goes for the individual. So that's also why I think certainly for the live event space, we are going to see a rebound effect. In fact, we're already seeing it in some places. So, so a little anecdote there before we close, I guess, given that most questions seem to have been addressed and answered, is that I actually had a client in India who asked me to do a fireside chat, more informally still than this, about what I do and the kind of thinking that I've put forth, how to solve pragmatically some of the issues that they've been facing there. We had over 100,000 people attend that webinar and that broadcast, which once I had a conversation, with the person, you have absolutely no way of knowing that. So whether there's ultimately 10 people or 100,000, it feels exactly the same. And it's really odd, I think. So certainly there are some aspects of digital workshops, digital keynotes, digital fireside chat. This to me is more of an informal sharing than anything else. It's not really a classic keynote, but those things, they take a different dynamic. And I think for especially this channel, we will all determine for ourselves how much of this virtual world we want to keep going and keep up once we can have the choice again. So with that, I'd like to invite you also to really, make the most of this time. Who knows whether there's going to be a second wave, when it will happen, how our world will look like. This is probably a call to action to live in the moment, even if the moment involves you being in your apartment and maybe locked down or just having to spend time working from home. Make the most of it, because we're all in the same boat, and it feels better that way. So thanks for your attention and questions. And without any further ado, if there's anything more, then I'll conclude it here. All right. Good. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I wish you all a very good rest of your evening. Thank you.